Hi guys, I'm Markus Johansson from Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm just going to start my presentation on 10 things that every Umbraco developer should know. So just short introduction about myself. I'm an Umbracan since 2007. I've been working with Umbraco since version 3. I'm a partner at a web agency here in Stockholm called Obviuse. Been to CodeGarden 9 times. I'm a core contributor, and I've also been doing a fair share of package development. For example, I've done a package called Newsletter Studio, a commercial package where you can create campaigns and transactional emails inside of the back office of Umbraco. I'm also behind the great dashboard package. It's actually called the dashboard. So this is just a simple way to show editors recent changes and content in the content section of Umbraco. So this presentation, it's a lot of things to cover. So it's going to scratch the surface of many things. It's going to be high and low, and for newbie or pro. So I hope that everybody gets something out of this. And if you have questions or want to dig deeper to something, just go ahead and contact me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to help. And there's also going to be a Q&A later. So feel free to ask questions there. So with that, let's get started. My first tip and trick here is really fundamental. So this is more about the content journey inside of Umbraco, how content is stored and how it's handled in Umbraco. So we've all seen a document type. Hopefully, if you've used Umbraco as a developer, you configure the document type. So a document type has properties, and they are grouped into groups. It used to be called tabs, and I'm happy that they're bringing tabs back now. So groups of properties, if we zoom on into a property, in this case, the beer picker, it has heading, description, some validation settings, but the most important part, of course, is the data type. In this case, it's presented as a drop-down list. And if we zoom into the data type is actually a visual presentation. So that's the property editor, but it's also configuration. And these two together creates the data type. So the Umbraco core has a lot of property editors, for example, text string, multi-node tree picker, media picker, nested content, and the rich text editor. All of these are property editors. But when we configure a data type, we're using a property editor like this, and then we're configuring the configuration. Together, we make them a data type. If we look at a rich text editor, for example, we choose the property editor, rich text editor, we configure the toolbar, and this will make our data type. So a property editor can be used in any number of data types. So we can use the same visual element from the property editor and alter its behavior using the configuration. So this is really important, the distinguishing between the property editors and data types. So a document type has properties that has data types, and the data type has property editor and configuration. All right, so I'm thinking that we should continue this journey with the content and how it's stored in Umbraco. So I'm going to talk a little about how this ends up in the front end. And this brings us to property value converters. So I'm going to present this with an example. Here we have a multi-node tree picker. I've picked 3 items here, 3 related pages. And when we use this in our front end, this is one way of getting our hands on these related pages. It's by going model.value and then passing in the type that we're expecting, a IEnumerable of iPublish content, and using a magic string with the alias of our document type property. A better way, of course, is to use models builder. This will give us the strongly typed way of accessing these properties, which of course is the recommended way of doing this as well. But if we look under the hood here, the data that's stored in the database when we save this multi-node tree picker is actually a comma-separated string of UDIs. So this is what's stored in the database tables, a unique identifier to the content items that we have picked. And the job of, I'm going a little bit ahead here. UDI, I was trying to figure out what it stands for, but it turns out that the documentation says that UDI is not an acronym for something. There's no official definition. So I'm sorry, I can't really tell you what it means, but this is a UDI, basically an identifier for something in Umbraco. Could be content, could be media. Jumping back to the property value converter, the job of the property value converter is to create something useful for the front end. So a value converter is a class that knows how to convert its stored data into something useful for the front end. So the example with multi-node tree picker here, it will take the UDIs from the database and create a list of iPublished content from the cache. So these property value converters is basically simple classes that tells Umbraco that, hey, I know how to convert multi-node tree picker data into something useful for the front end. And these property value converters, they can return different types depending on the configuration on the data type. So one example here is if we're using multi-node tree picker, for example, and we configure this one to allow a minimum of one item and a maximum of one item. This means that we know that we're always going to have at least one and a maximum of one item selected. The core property value converter will still return an IEnumerable of iPublished content. So in our views or in our controllers, we would have to go model.relatedcontent.first.name, even though we know that there's just one item. But it would be possible to just return iPublished content in this scenario and make it possible to go model.relatedcontent.name. And there's a great package created by Colin White called Super Value Converters that you can use in your Umbraco installation and get even better types from your property value converters. And another thing that's really important here is that when you're building your own property editors, don't forget to also create a property value converter. The next topic that I want to touch on is the database versus the cache. This is really important when you're implementing Umbraco sites. So when you're saving content in Umbraco, the content, if you press the save button, we're storing the content in the database. And when you press save and publish, we'll store the content in the database, but we'll also publish it to the cache. And the thing that's really important is that your front-end website should always read content from the cache. We should avoid hitting the database on the front end. And this is done, of course, by using the cache, making sure that the models that you work with is iPublished content, using the Umbraco helper, or using the published content cache on the Umbraco context. You should avoid using the database like iContent or the content service, media service, things like that, because this is data read from the database. Of course, there are scenarios where this is valid, but if you're doing it, you should have to think twice about why you're doing it. So how do you make sure that you're using the cache? Well, it's really simple. If you're using a render MVC controller or a surface controller or in the views, there's a property called Umbraco that's exposed. This is the Umbraco helper. So it's really easy for you to make sure that you're using it. You should avoid using the services in these scenarios. If you're building your own service, a background job or something like that, that depends on Umbraco content, you should use the Umbraco context factory and the iScope provider. So an example of this here is a blog service that I've created just to show this. I'm passing in these dependencies via the constructor, and the IOC container will take care of this. And I'm also creating a scope that will be auto-completed, and I'm ensuring that the Umbraco context is available, and then I'm reading the content from the Umbraco context. So this code is a little bit more complicated than the first examples inside of the controllers, but the good thing with this is that this approach will work if you're trying to access the cache inside of background jobs. For example, if you're running Handfire, if you have Umbraco returning tasks or background task, or if you're using an Umbraco event that it's executed in its own thread. So this way of accessing the cache is safe for all these scenarios, which the Umbraco helper is not, because it depends on things that's bound to the request that's coming in at the moment. There's a detailed forum post about this on R, which you can go ahead and read, and I'll share the slides, of course, so you don't have to type the whole URL. The next thing that I want to put some awareness around is content versions. So all content in Umbraco is versioned. So every time you save and publish something in Umbraco, a version is created. And you can see that if you go to the info tab, there's versions, and you can also roll back to previous versions of the content, which is a really convenient feature. And it took me years to realize that this was the case. But this also means that we should avoid storing data that's changing a lot as content in Umbraco. For example, if we're running an import job or something like that every 30 minutes, this would create 48 versions every day. And in a year, that would be 17,520 versions. The thing is that you should avoid storing volatile data as content in Umbraco, because the default setup with Umbraco is that there's an unlimited number of versions. So there's nothing that will prevent you from creating as many versions as you could until you run out of data on the server. But there's a great package for this that you can download and put in your Umbraco site that will make sure to clean up old versions. And you can configure this how it should work. We're using this on most of our websites. And it's really nice to have control over the number of versions that gets created. So tip number 5 for a Umbraco developer is Models Builder and understanding Models Builder. I think that most of us is using Models Builder at the moment. It provides strongly typed models for our views and was introduced not long ago, back in Umbraco 7 something, I don't know. But before that, we had to go model.getPropertyValue and then pass in the alias of the property. And after Models Builder, of course, we can use a strongly typed way to access our properties. And these models that Models Builder creates is actually wrappers around iPublish content. So it's not super complicated. We use this setup in all our websites. We use live app data, which means that we'll create C# files and put them in our projects and compile them with our projects. And we also put our model files in a separate project. That's optional. But it works good for us. So basically, you'll see a lot of files inside of Visual Studio, and this is the models that Models Builder creates every time you change something on a document type. And this means that we can go ahead in our views and you go model.pageTitle, and under the hood, inside of these models generated by Models Builder, it's a quite simple thing that happens. The page title property basically just called this.value, passing in the type that we're expecting, and the magic string. But the good thing with this is that we don't have to think about all these magic strings everywhere inside of our project. So these Models Builder models can also be created. If you have an instance of iPublish content, for example, you can just pass it in to one of the Models Builder models, and you'll get strongly typed access to this by going blogpost.pageTitle. And Models Builder also makes Umbraco return actual instances of the model class. So if we have a look at this, when I'm getting a blog post from the content cache here, you can see that the type of this one, even though it's an iPublish content, the actual type is a blog post. So we can just go ahead and cast it in our views if we want to. And if you're using compositions, like the example here, some kind of hero on our blog post document type, this would create an interface as a model in Models Builder that we can use when we're having an instance of iPublish content. We can go and check if our content is a hero, and then we can go ahead and use the hero strongly typed. Jumping forward to my tip number 6 around debugging. So of course, as a .NET developer, we have great tooling for this inside of Visual Studio. We have the debugger, we have breakpoints and everything. I'm going to talk about some of the Umbraco specific things that you can use here to try to find errors and problems inside of your Umbraco websites. So we all seen the log viewer inside of the back office, a great tool where you can see everything that happens, everything that gets written to the logs, you can see them directly in the back office. And these log files are stored on disk as well in appdata/logs on V8. And you can actually go ahead and grab these files from your production environment and go to your dev machine and have a look at them. And I tend to use Compact Log Viewer by Warren Buckley, which is a great little cross-platform app that can read these files. You can also use the logger in your own code if you want to. And this is really simple. Let's say that you have a service here and you just inject the iLogger into your service, and then you can go ahead and write your own log statements into the Umbraco log. There's different log levels that you can use. You can use debug, warning, error, info, and depending on your configuration, this will or will not be written to the log. For example, in production, you might just use warnings and errors, I don't know. Another cool thing around logging is the iProfiling logger that you can inject as well. This is really cool if you want to measure how long time parts of your code is taking to execute. So let's say that I want to measure the block here, the really complicated thread.sleep. I can just pass in the iProfiling logger and go trace duration with a message when it starts and another message when it's done. And in my log then, I'll get both of these logged, and we can go in and look at it and make sure that if there's a long running thing that we're doing during startup or whatever, we can see how long time this takes and optimize it if we need to. So my next tip number 7, is around Lucene and Examine. There was a great talk by Colum about this earlier today. I really recommend going back and watch that if you missed it. But basically, Examine or Lucene is a search index or multiple search indexes inside of Umbraco. It provides search for the back office and for the front end if you want to implement that. Underneath the hood, it uses a very powerful search engine or search index called Lucene.net. Examine is basically an API on top of Lucene. And Umbraco Examine is an API on top of Examine. So this is to make the use of Lucene.net easier inside of Umbraco. And this Examine is really nice and really good if you're building search or if you're building something that is working with a lot of data. For example, if you're building a product filter or an article filter or something like that, you might consider using Examine instead of filtering stuff from the cache. So going back to this about performance in the front end, the database, getting stuff from the database that contains all content and all versions is really slow. It's fast to read the content from the cache, working with iPublish content, using the Umbraco helper or the Umbraco context content cache property. Use this in listings where you want to list children or something like that, or in small, mid-size listings where you have a filter. But if you're working on bigger things, you might consider using Examine. So Examine would store all the data as documents in the search index, and you will reach this using the Examine manager. So this can be used for free text search, but also really good for filtering, lots of filters, or if you have a lot of data, then Examine will be more performant. So I actually went ahead and tested this. So I started with my own little test to see here. The green is how new cache performs, and the blue ones is how Lucene would perform. So if there's a small amount of items, getting these from the cache and performing the filter is actually fast up until somewhere around 500 items. Then it starts to get slower and slower, or it starts to get slower and slower all the time. But the more items, the slower the cache would be. And as you can see, the blue lines, Lucene, it's actually slower than new cache when there's few items, but it's consistent along the way. So when your data grows, Lucene will still be a fast option. So after I did this, I actually realized that someone else already did it. So there's a great presentation about this. I'm going to talk more about that later. But some conclusions and some things to keep in mind here. New cache is really fast. So compared to V7, using the cache to do things like this is a lot faster. You can prefer to use new cache if there's less than 500 nodes that you're working with in some way. I have to say something here as well. I didn't look at the memory usage, but I can imagine that Lucene is using a little bit less memory. I don't know. So you have to test this. But as a rule of thumb, maybe this is good advice. If there's more than 500 items to filter, or if you know that the data is going to grow over time, I would use Examine to perform the filtering. And just to be clear here, the tests that I did, even though it looked dramatic, we're still talking about 1 to 3 milliseconds here. So it's still extremely fast, no matter which one of these ways you're using. So Examine really shines when there's a large data set and when you want to filter on a lot of properties, then you should really use Examine. And like I said, there's another presentation from Umbraco Spark with Paul and Tim here. They've done a great job going into detail about this. So if you want to know more about it, go ahead and download my slides afterwards and have a look at their presentation as well. So I just want to point out one last thing regarding Lucene, and that's the Luke tool. It's a Java tool that you can install on your machine or actually just run on your machine that you can use to look at your indexes. You can look at which fields are in the documents and how they are tokenized and everything like that. It's really useful to debug issues that you have or if you're setting up your own indexes and anything like that. So look for your Lucene indexes. So my 8th topic for today is going to be around IOC and DI, so inversion of control and dependency injection. So this is basically the practice about injecting your dependencies into your classes. And this is probably something that you've seen before or maybe that you're using every day. It's going to be, or it is, a first-class citizen in .NET Core, .NET 5. So this is something that we all have to learn and get our hands dirty with in the upcoming years, especially now when Umbraco is moving to .NET 5. So a really simple explanation about this. What you should do is that you should inject your dependencies or abstractions of your dependencies into your classes. And you shouldn't use service locators like this when you were using the current class in Umbraco, because this is an anti-pattern and it makes your code really hard to test. So injecting your dependencies is the way to do it. And in V8, you would register your dependencies and your own services using a IUser service, or sorry, IUser composer. And first of all, you will declare your abstractions type and then the concrete implementation of this abstraction, and you will set a lifetime. And this is actually the reason that I talked about this, because lifetimes is a little bit confusing with Umbraco, or Umbraco 8 at least. So Umbraco 8 uses light inject as the DI container or IOC container. Basically, there's a different types of lifetime. So there's something called transient. This means that you will get a new instance every time you request one. There's something called a singleton. This means that the instance that you get will be the same for the lifetime of the application. There's also something called a scoped lifetime. And this means that you will get a new instance for every scope that's created in the IOC container. And with Umbraco, a scope is the same thing as a web request. But to make things more confusing, there's also a lifetime called request. But this lifetime means that the lifetime of the instance will be one new for every request to the IOC container. So you can think of this as similar to transients. It's not, but I'm not using that in my code. So I tend to use the first 3, which also match well to how it works in .NET Core and .NET 5. Tip number 9 around data and databases. So Umbraco uses something called NPOCO. And then you can think of this as, or it is a micro ORM that you use to read, update, and delete data in your database. You can think of this as a lightweight version of Entity Framework. I know that people probably would hate me for that comparison, but it's a micro ORM. So you can use this in your code for custom tables if you want to, but I also want to point out that there's nothing wrong with using Entity Framework if you prefer that. And especially in .NET 5, where Entity Framework Core is becoming really fast. I read that it's actually beating Dapper now. So we're talking nice speed, which makes EF more relevant. But if you're building a package for V8 at least, or until Umbraco changes the way of fetching data, you should avoid using Entity Framework in your package. You don't want to enforce that dependency on the users of your package. If you want to use NPOCO in your own code, it's really simple. You need to inject a iScope provider into your code or your repository in this case. You create a scope, in this case, a scope that auto-completes, which means that the transaction will be completed automatically. And then here, we'll just writing a query, strongly typed query, using our movie DTO that I created, just a simple POCO class. So if you want to, these scopes, they are actually, they will create a database transaction. And you can nest these scopes. So here's an example where I create an outer scope here, and I'm calling a service inside of Umbraco that will create a scope. And I'm also calling my own repository and saving something. But if this goes good, I'll commit or complete the scope. But if something goes wrong inside of my save method in the movie repository, I will roll back the whole transaction, which means that the content wouldn't be saved to Umbraco. So this is a really nice feature. But when you're starting to use these scopes, it's really important that you complete them, because otherwise strange things might happen. And I've been there having to go through all my code, just looking for this one place where I forgot to complete the scope. And this was, of course, the cause of all the issues. And so the takeaway from that is to always be really cautious about closing or committing the scopes. So I have my last tip that I think that every Umbraco developer should know about, and this is an AngularJS hack, and I've heard Philip talking about this yesterday, so he's going to probably hate me for pointing this out, but I do love it. There's something in the back office and in AngularJS called a HTTP provider inceptor. So this is basically a way to intercept the requests and responses from the back office to the Umbraco back office APIs. And why would you want to do that? It sounds crazy, but I've actually used it a couple of times in a production environment. So the last thing that I did was that I wanted to add a plugin to TinyMC. And I guess you're thinking, well, it can be configured in tinymc.config. And yes, I tried that. I configured my plugin, but it turns out that Umbraco will actually lowercase the plugin name. So when the back office requests the configuration for for TinyMC, my plugin name was lowercase, but it has to be the correct name, because otherwise TinyMC can't load the plugin. So I created this little inceptor that actually looks for my plugin with the lowercase e and replace it with a uppercase e. And adding this inceptor made this work. And while I use this right now for our client, I've created an issue on Umbraco, on GitHub, to fix this error in the core. But while waiting for the fix, it's a good way to hack around these kind of issues. Another thing that I did with Umbraco Forms, for example, this is like the default form that you get when you create a new form. And our clients was like, do we have to have this? And why is it in English? We are in Sweden. We figured, well, you don't have to have this actually, but it's impossible to remove it. It's actually hard-coded inside one of the controllers in Forms, or it used to be. So I created an issue. I said, well, can we make this configurable in some way? So that's an ongoing issue. But while I'm waiting for that, I actually hacked around. So the endpoint that's creating this empty form, I'm actually looking for a call to that endpoint. And if it's found, I'll pop one of these fields from the list, which means that our editors will get a clean form every time they create a new one. And that's it. That's my 10 tips, 80 slides in 30 minutes. I was quite nervous. I didn't know that it was 30 minutes, and I realized that 10 things in 30 minutes is a lot of things. But the slides is online, and I'm available at Twitter, of course, if you want to ask questions or use the Q&A. I'm happy to answer questions, and yeah. Thanks a lot for listening.